The Federal Deficit Does Not Matter, video number 6, P.O.O.F.O.S.I.E. And this revised version of video 6, we will use economic data from fiscal year 2019, while at the same time asking you to keep in mind that this entire series of videos, all titled The Federal Deficit Does Not Matter, serves as a documentation, the only documentation of this kind, of the economic change, transformation, if you will, at this pivotal juncture in and of historical significance as it relates to our national and indeed our international economic system. This series of videos enables one to understand how it is that we, the people of the United States, can and have reportedly spent $7 trillion for nation building in the Middle East, while admitting to having a $23 trillion federal deficit in early 2020, which could be a lot more and probably is, in my opinion, and still having all the fake news media outlets reporting on how well the economy is doing. And here is the irony, the conundrum, which is that the economy has improved, and this series of videos explains how and why this is so, while having a federal deficit in the tens of trillions that will never, should never, can never be paid back. We are going to start off with the examination of yet more proof positive that the federal deficit does not matter by presenting the now published online information about the amount of deficit spending that is not really debt spending already expended, and again using fiscal year 2019 data, which started October 1st, 2018, and coupled with all the positive economic news such as record low unemployment as well as a booming stock market, and then applying this perspective to how it is possible to have a single payer / universal health care program or a Medicare for all health care program by using this same system of funding that has resulted in having an enormous, though irrelevant, federal deficit. This funding system being what our federal employees call monetizing and or quantitative easing, as illustrated in video 3 with this same title, which means that we, the people, by way of our federal employees, can and eventually will electronically generate the monies needed in order to pay for said health care program, which means that there are no federal income tax monies involved. Stated again more simplistically, we print the monies needed electronically to pay for approximately 1/4 to 1/3 of all of our federal expenditures already, and we can and eventually will employ this same funding system in order to provide funding for health care for everyone in the United States. And keep in mind that this is we the people's monies we're talking about, not federal income tax monies. This perspective, which deals with electronically generated monies and the federal deficit being irrelevant, is what the pernicious corporate fake news media, including the good folks at Fox News, as far as this subject is concerned, never acknowledges, nor has any political candidate so far, but instead some of them talk about putting the gangsta health insurance companies out of business, which is kind of partially true, and they also talk about a big federal tax increase on the wealthy to pay for this new health care program, which law, if passed, would have every loophole in the book and would never be enforced in any case if enacted into law, and they all know it. What would happen if a single-payer / universal health care program of any kind or name were to be enacted is that when the bills come due for health care and there are insufficient funds available from taxing the rich, our federal employees would do what we've always done in such case, which is to electronically generate the monies needed, as in monetizing and or quantitative easing. Let's get real as far as the really elite rich paying taxes by recalling some of the occurrences in the past, beginning with, though not starting with, Leona Helmsley and her statement about, and I quote, "only the little people pay taxes," end quote. How about President Trump and him not paying any taxes for 8 out of 10 years? Then remember the story about GE not paying any taxes, which allowed GE to create 35,000 new jobs in China, and more recently Amazon paying no taxes. This is just off the top of my head without going online and doing research about the really elite rich not paying taxes. The point being made is that our politicians could pass a health care bill while knowing full well that it will end up being paid for with we the people's electronically generated monies without admitting publicly that the deficit does not matter. A kind of backdoor way of saying the federal deficit is irrelevant without saying the federal deficit is irrelevant. This speaks to the reason why our politicians are so very reluctant to come forward and admit that the deficit is irrelevant, which reason it seems is mainly the threat of runaway inflation and equally salient, the directly associated reasoning that if we, the people of the United States, can electronically generate monies to meet federal expenditures, so then why can't every other sovereign nation? And the answer is that they can and eventually will. Then ultimately this means, and especially for the Democrats, but also for President Trump, that there is the question about why they all dismissed former President George W. Bush and former Vice President Dick Cheney when these men publicly stated, and I quote, "The deficit does not matter," end quote, more than 10 years ago, which now brings us to this pivotal point in history. Our political leaders, as well as the corporate fake news media, but especially our political leaders, need to revoke their dismissal of former President George W. Bush and former Vice President Dick Cheney by acknowledging that the federal deficit is irrelevant. The main question would then become not whether or not the deficit is irrelevant, but rather who do we the people want as our president, a Democrat or a Republican or perhaps even an independent? There are a plethora of news articles online that address the federal deficit subject, but as yet no one in the mainstream news media, to my knowledge, has made the connection with their reporting on the deficit and it being irrelevant, and this speaks to their reluctance to admitting that they have missed the biggest economic news story in the history of creation, though it has been staring them in the face for over a decade now, and this goes for all of our political leaders as well, except of course for former President George W. Bush and former Vice President Dick Cheney. It does seem that these people would rather die than admit to their delusion more than their ignorance when it comes to the subject of the federal deficit being totally irrelevant. This is to say that there are some very intelligent individuals who just can't accept the reality of our deficit being irrelevant, and the reason why they are having such a difficult time with this reality is more a question for Dr. Phil than it is for Dr. Einstein. I'm not saying all these people are nuts, but they are pretty close, and no, this is not a slight against the American people in general. Most of us, as stated repeatedly by the corporate fake news media, live from hand to mouth, from paycheck to paycheck, while depending on the news media and our politicians to lead and inform on such matters while we keep the nation rolling along with our toil, blood, sweat, and tears. They have obviously failed us when it comes to reporting on the federal deficit and it being irrelevant. With all this being stated, let's review in part for the purpose of comment a couple of online news articles that really illustrate the delusional and yes, ignorance as illustrated by the obvious disconnect when reporting on the deficit and the irrelevance of same, and this is a sort of composite of all such reporting without attributing to any specific reporter. In March, the story covered by several reporters was that the deficit grew by 77% in the first 4 months of fiscal 2019 compared with the same period 1 year earlier, as stated by the Treasury, and please keep in mind that we are talking about electronically generated monies. The $310 billion for the total deficit for these 4 months is up from $176 billion for the same time period a year before, and as should be obvious to everyone by now, neither political party is bothering to address this subject as far as a real solution is involved, which of course is to finally admit that the federal deficit is irrelevant and then take it from there. We shouldn't hold our breath. In June, it was reported that the budget, so-called deficit, had increased to $738.6 billion in the first 8 months of fiscal year 2019, a $206 billion increase from the previous year time period, and this despite the tariff revenue generated by imported goods. Then reports went on to say that the deficit is expected to reach $879 billion this fiscal year, which is an increase from $779 billion the year before, with the Congressional Budget Office predicting a rise to more than $1 trillion in fiscal 2022. And don't be surprised when this figure comes in at a lot more, because we have had a yearly $1 trillion in deficit spending for years, and now we have these people acting like it's something new or unexpected. Need I mention the Consolidated Appropriations Act 2018 as covered in Video 5 that will add $4 trillion to our federal deficit over the next 10 years, as well as the other unaccounted for federal expenditures, which already has our yearly deficit spending at more than this $1 trillion figure. And to be fair, they may be trying to squeeze in some of this pre-scheduled spending, but not all of it for sure. Keep in mind that we still have the testimony of Catherine Austin Fitts, Professor Skidmore, the IG's report on that $10 trillion unaccounted for in the DoD budget, which has been accumulating since the 70s. It should also be stated, just for the record, that these people are not on board when it comes to the notion of our federal deficit being irrelevant, but they are very bright individuals, and they will eventually catch on if they haven't already. The reason for drawing attention to the March and June fiscal year reporting is to illustrate how difficult, even impossible at this time, it seems to be for we the people to count on the news media as well as our politicians to tell we the people the truth about what is really going on, and especially when it comes to we the people's electronically generated monies. And the reason they are all having such a difficult time is because they are refusing to accept reality. The reality of how and why our federal deficit is irrelevant, which is fully illustrated in my book, the revised second edition, titled All About Equity Spending with a Love Story. And as stated in my previous videos with the same titles, it is the only book in the entire world at this time that fully illustrates how and why our federal deficit is irrelevant. In closing for this sixth video, please allow me to once again state the inevitable conclusion that we shall hopefully all come to accept, which is that the federal deficit is indeed irrelevant, which means that we don't actually have a national debt, but rather we have a pretend national debt, which means that there is no need for any type of federal income tax, which ultimately means that we the people will come to accept the reality of there being no monies going into the United States Treasury, only monies going out. This is our future if we will accept it, and again, it has absolutely nothing to do with socialism or communism. In Video 7, there will be more elaboration while we examine a possible, believe it or not, and allow me to stress possible UFO/ET connection to we the people accepting the reality of the federal deficit being irrelevant. I know this subject is viewed as being for the crazies by some people, but certainly not all, not anymore, and there is this possibility. As for being considered as being crazy, well, that's what some lesser minds have been saying about me for many years now, as related to my understanding about the deficit being irrelevant, and I'm right about that as well. I'll throw this out there for everyone. However, it will most likely be more appreciated by the UFO/ET researchers and you folks who, like me, are of the Christian household of faith. This bit of information is directly related to the fulfillment of Bible prophecy, as it is also related to the possible UFO/ET connection to our acceptance of the federal deficit being irrelevant. Just mull it over and keep it in mind for future reference, and it will make a lot more sense later on, as well as there being more clarity provided in Video 7. Everything truly is connected. In the Bible, the King James Version being the most reliable version for the English language, the word earth is a homonym, which sometimes refers to earth as meaning the universe, and other times refers to earth as meaning the planet Earth. The following verses refer to earth as meaning the universe. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Matthew chapter 6, verse 10. Mark chapter 13, verse 27. Revelation chapter 12, verse 9. One verse where the word earth refers to the planet Earth is Luke chapter 18, verse 8. And all of these are, of course, just a few examples out of the 978 times, more or less, where the word earth occurs in the Bible, the King James Version. Video 6 transcript is available on my Facebook page, P.O.O.F.O.S.I E.